I really like SpaceGodzilla. I am kind of a sucker for Godzilla's clone kaiju. Biolante's really cool, Orga's another favorite of mine, Mechagodzilla, I mean, what do I have to say about that one? SpaceGodzilla is no exception. I think it's kinda disappointing that he really hasn't got a chance to reappear. His sole film outing, Godzilla vs. SpaceGodzilla, is often considered one of the weaker entries of the series. I really like it, though, but that isn't what today's video is about. Today, I wanted to share with all of you my idea for another SpaceGodzilla film, because I think it's kind of a shame that his only appearance was versus SpaceGodzilla, and I think if he got another moment to shine, I think he'd be a lot more appreciated. Now, before we get into this brainstorming fanfiction session, I just want to go over how this format's going to work, because I do plan to do more of these kinds of videos. First, I'm not going to be trying to fit him into another series, so no What If SpaceGodzilla was in the MonsterVerse, Showa timeline, one of the Millennium timelines, or like in a -1 sequel. Also, just at least for this video, I'm not going to ask the question of what if SpaceGodzilla showed back up in Heisei, because that's not what I want to do. I also want to stick to being as faithful to the character as I can, while still giving it my own creative twist. I do want to do more of these kinds of videos in the future, so if you have any monsters you'd like to see a story written around, leave them down below. Every story takes place in a world that had events happening before the events of the story take place. And this story is going to be no different. So, I'm going to start with the background. And this kind of was really tough to write because I don't really write out my story ideas very much. And typically, I just have it all in my head. And I made this story specifically with the intent to write it down. And this was a really fun exercise. So, this backstory went through a few changes here and there. I'll probably talk about them after I'm done reading out this backstory to you all. So, here's what I got. In the year 1954, Godzilla first surfaced in Tokyo and began an age of monsters. Monster attacks happened very frequently around the world. Rodan in Moscow in 1956, Anguirus in Paris 1959, Varan in Osaka 1960, Baragon in Los Angeles 1963. These are just some of the many monsters that plagued this world. In the mid-1960s, the USA began studying skin samples left over from many of these monster attacks. This laid the groundwork for a new branch of biological study, monsterology. Monsterologists noticed that Godzilla's cells were special, as they were able to continuously regenerate under almost any circumstance. Fire, freezing, acids, immense pressure, radiation, poisons, and even destroying the cell's nucleus and DNA were all ineffective in stopping these cells from repairing themselves. During the Age of Monsters, the space race continued. However, on the mission Apollo 11, we encountered our first space monster, Dogora. Dogora was a colony of cells living just outside of the Earth's atmosphere that could coalesce into a giant jellyfish-like organism. The Apollo 12 and 13 missions brought back Dogora cells for study on Earth. The US government wanted to find a way to stop Godzilla's regenerative capabilities, so they looked to cosmic rays and the vacuum of space. The Apollo 14 mission was sent with a sample of G cells that they would release onto the moon and recollect and observe on later missions. Every subsequent mission yielded unsatisfactory results. The cosmic rays were enhancing their regenerative rates. Apollo 17 would be the final mission to the moon, as when they arrived, they found a developing Godzilla on the moon. The moon would then be deemed too dangerous to return to. So that's just the sort of backstory or prologue. Some of the changes that went through were just not including any other monsters, but I feel like a lot of Godzilla stories, at least nowadays, are kind of origin stories and Godzilla's really the only monster. And I think that's not lame per se, but I wish that more Godzilla movies utilize the greater pantheon of monsters that Godzilla still has. It's been quite a while since we've seen old familiar faces like Gabara or Titanosaurus. Baragon hasn't made an appearance since GMK. Varan hasn't even showed up since Destroy All Monsters. So I just kind of wanted to give a nod to these old characters that I actually really like. Another thing that I couldn't think of a better name for this: monsterology and monsterologists. I do think that in a world of giant creatures that defy the laws of science, would kind of open up a new branch in biology. The existence of creatures that are completely different to anything we have, yeah, I think that would open up a new branch of biology. I mean, we have branches of biology that are just focused on specific kinds of creatures. Etymology, what's it called? The one for fish. It'll be on screen because I can't remember the name right now. But stuff like that, microbiology. Those are all disciplines of biology that focus on one kind of living creature. You know. Yeah. So I thought, okay, why not a biological study that focuses just on these giant monsters? And it went through a few names. I could never come up with one that I'm satisfied with, but I do kind of like monsterology and monsterologist, just because I think they sound funny and give the story a bit of a sort of 1960s, 1950s, 1970s sort of sci-fi flair that I'm kind of going for a bit with this story, at least with its prologue. And also I did take some inspiration from a bit of the moon landing conspiracies, mostly stuff about like what did we find on the moon that makes us not want to go back and all that. And I don't believe any of those, and I don't condone any of those. I think they're all stupid. But I do think that it's fun to incorporate at least some idea of these things in fantasies, to speak, because I just think that these sorts of stories are interesting. Like, I don't believe any of this, and I think it's all bullshit. That we found, like, alien ruins, or there's aliens on the moon, or it's all fake. I think that's all stupid and dumb and not true. It's dumb. But I do think it's kind of interesting to kind of take these concepts and be like, well, what if there was a world where this was true, and instead of being like, well, it's whatever the conspiracy theorists say, what if it's whatever my story wants it to be? Like, I know this is dumb, but the Michael Bay Transformers movies, the third one, has, like, the Transformers being the things that helped us get to the moon, and we found them on the moon, and it's really stupid, but I think it's, like, fun, and I like doing this sort of thing. But yeah, that was just the prologue. So now I'm actually going to read the actual plot synopsis for this movie. It's not going to be very in-depth. It's going to be very just sort of shallow. And that's because I just did not feel like writing a whole ass movie script. And I also don't know how to write that. But I do know how to write my vague ideas down on paper. So that's what I'm going to do. 1983. Godzilla has resurfaced for the first time in 5 years. This time showing up off the west coast of the United States. Projections suggest that he's making landfall near the Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant to feed. Near the power plant is a hyper-maser cannon dubbed Moonshooter 1 that fires high-energy maser beams at the moon in hopes of destroying what the US government has dubbed SpaceGodzilla. Godzilla fights the military, destroys the reactors and the maser cannon, then continues his trek southward to the San Onofre nuclear generating station, which also happens to be located near another moonshooter. NASA HQ receives word of the destruction of Moonshooter 1 and the potential destruction of Moonshooter 4. This is where we're introduced to our protagonists, a small team of NASA scientists and monsterologists who are tasked with monitoring SpaceGodzilla and coming up with a way to destroy it. Recent findings show that the creature is now nearing the size of Godzilla himself at about 50-ish meters, and is seeming like it'll grow to be even bigger. It seems to have integrated crystalline elements found on the moon into its DNA somehow, and has begun growing these crystals on its shoulders. The rate of its development is increasing exponentially. Godzilla continues his march down the California coast. Entire cities are evacuated in his wake, and the military has set up multiple blockades along the path to try to impede his progress. The first big skirmish occurring just north of LA. Godzilla emerges victorious. In his victory, Godzilla roars up at the full moon. At that moment, a bright purple flash was seen on the moon, visible to the naked eye from all on Earth. Back at NASA HQ, our team has found that the creature's development is nearing completion. The purple flash was it gaining the ability to hover. As Godzilla nears Moonshooter 4, a sudden meteor storm from the moon halts the monster and destroys Moonshooter 4. Our team realizes that somehow SpaceGodzilla is aware of the moonshooters and their locations, and seems to have psychic abilities. It's now targeting the moonshooters. As the 10 other moonshooters in the US are struck with targeted meteor storms, SpaceGodzilla leaves the moon's surface, and in an up-close encounter with the lunar orbiter used to monitor the monster, it looks into the camera. Its eyes communicate an almost human intelligence. The creature smiles maliciously before destroying the orbiter. Our NASA crew is stunned. After some brainstorming, they conclude the only way to stop SpaceGodzilla is to have SpaceGodzilla and Godzilla fight, and hope that the two kill each other, or at the very least, Godzilla kills SpaceGodzilla. An emergency meeting is held with our team, top military officials, and the president to propose the idea of having Godzilla kill SpaceGodzilla. This idea does not go over well. However, the president begrudgingly agrees. Godzilla returns to the ocean to rest. NASA predicts SpaceGodzilla will land on Earth in about 3 days and seems to have its sights set on somewhere near Washington, D.C. Meteor storms begin to rain down on the capital, and evacuation efforts are put into place immediately. With the plan to lure Godzilla approved, our team heads out west to try and execute the plan to have Godzilla march all the way across the US, being led by a trainload of nuclear elements. Godzilla takes the bait and begins to follow the train. About halfway through the operation, however, the train is derailed by Baragon, who is also chasing the train. A battle begins between the two monsters, but it's cut short by a meteor shower. Godzilla begins to march towards the origin of the meteors, and Baragon disappears underground. DC is completely evacuated, and as the meteor showers went on, giant crystalline structures began to form. SpaceGodzilla has touched down in DC. Godzilla is not too far away. Godzilla and SpaceGodzilla meet and begin their battle in the city. Godzilla is the underdog in this battle and is completely outmatched by SpaceGodzilla's psychic abilities, super powerful corona beams, and his very human intelligence. As their battle rages on, Baragon jumps in to try to challenge SpaceGodzilla as well. Our team then begins to realize that SpaceGodzilla is siphoning energy from the electrical grid through its crystal fortress, then into its body via its giant crystal spikes on its shoulders. Godzilla and Baragon are not enough to defeat SpaceGodzilla. Both monsters are outclassed by its pure, raw power. Our NASA crew begin to try and convince the US military to help the monsters, knowing that the only way for us to persevere this battle is to work with the monsters instead of to try to destroy them. Begrudgingly, the US military agrees, and they begin to shoot a missile barrage at SpaceGodzilla's shoulders. This destroys the two crystal pauldrons on his shoulders, and with SpaceGodzilla weakened, the two Earth monsters are now able to begin to overpower the monster. Godzilla unleashes one final atomic breath into the creature's crystal crown on its forehead, causing the monster to explode into millions of tiny crystalline shards. Godzilla begins his trek back into the Pacific, and Baragon disappears underground yet again. The day is saved, but DC is in ruins. So yeah, this is the story I had, and it underwent a few changes, but with the prologue / backstory that I made, I kind of had a lot of what I wanted already done and in my mind. Some of the things that actually changed, though, was the inclusion of Baragon. I really like Baragon, and I just thought it'd be cool to see him show up. I was toying with Varen originally, but I think Baragon was sort of a better choice given some of the choices I made. That sounds really vague. What I mean is that originally the movie was going to surround a prophecy, and that Varen was going to be part of the prophecy, sort of akin to King Caesar's prophecy. But ultimately, with the idea of having the fight take place in DC and NASA being a huge part in this, I just didn't think I could include Varen, a monster who's kind of intrinsically tied to Japanese folklore almost. So yeah, I just kind of chose not to include him for that. Another thing was that the Dogora were also going to be a part of the story, but I felt like that was too unfair to Godzilla. Yeah, Godzilla versus SpaceGodzilla and Dogora, I think would have been too much for Godzilla. Maybe not, I don't know. I did want to include Mothra at some point in the story, but I just couldn't find a way to put her in, And then I'd kind of have to go into the discovery of Infant Island and how the fairies kind of work. I know not all Mothra stories have the fairy and whatnot, but I mean, when I write Mothra stuff, I love the magic and the sort of religion element to the character. So it's really hard for me to sort of separate those two ideas. Oh, my voice is getting shot. How fun. I kind of centered the movie around the action stuff because while I know a lot of Godzilla movies don't really center themselves around the action, but rather the sort of implications of the action, there's quite a few movies where a lot of the movie is just sort of centered around the action. And I didn't really develop the characters because I'm going for a more Showa style where a lot of the movie is the characters reacting to the monster's sort of rampage. That's not to say that that's a bad thing. I actually really like those movies. I love seeing people's reactions to these monsters and how it affects them. I also, again, this is just a very sort of shallow story synopsis, so it was never meant to really be completely fleshed out. Again, I'm not writing a whole script. Maybe I'll develop this more later in future videos. Who knows? And the plan to lure Godzilla changed quite a few times. One of the earlier ones I had was using a nuclear bomb. I didn't really want to go with that just because I don't like the usage of nuclear weapons in Godzilla movies itself. It's a bit of a contentious thing from my understanding, specifically with like King of the Monsters, and I didn't want to portray that the same way King of the Monsters did. I don't personally have a problem with the way it's done in King of the Monsters, but I know a lot of other people do, and I do kind of get where they're coming from with that. Or, no, I don't kind of get, I do get where they're coming from with that. It's kind of clunkily done, I think, just a little bit. So, I wanted to steer clear of using just straight up nuclear weapons to lure Godzilla. Whole argument of, well, the Godzilla series doesn't want you to glorify nuclear weapons, so don't make them a thing for good. And originally, another plan was to have humanity tranquilize Godzilla, but I didn't really like that idea, just because then I'd kind of have to go in the prologue about, well, how would they have done that? And I could say, like, oh, Aneb, but now, how do they lift him? These are all things that I tend to really focus on, is if humanity is somehow able to exert their will over a giant monster, how are they able to do that? And I think that's a really important question to ask in these sorts of things, I think. If ever I write stories or make stories where humanity somehow is able to, I guess, control the monsters, I think it's really important to know how. Because the monsters are nature, and humanity can't control nature. And in this movie, I hope it doesn't seem like humanity's controlling Godzilla. They're more, I don't want to say exploiting him, but they're working with him in his sort of way. And I imagine that after this story in this world, that humanity begins to find other ways to sort of do these cooperative things and begins to work towards a better future, realizing that the way they were going about it, of trying to constantly kill these monsters, ended up in this situation. A common theme in Godzilla movies is sort of man's hubris, and man's hubris in this is them thinking they can kill Godzilla and looking for more and more ways to do so, only ending up in them creating a monster more powerful than Godzilla. And the ending of having the only thing be able to stop Space Godzilla is having humanity team up with nature. I think with, well, nature, I mean the monsters. Monsters, in Godzilla movies, the kaiju are sort of usually stand-ins for Mother Nature. So the idea is humanity needs to work with nature, not against it, and not to sort of exploit it. And also the way Space Godzilla was killed was another thing that changed quite a few times. I did want to include Mogira at first, but I didn't want to just remake versus Space Godzilla. That's why I changed it to Baragon. It's sort of nod to Mogira because, giant mole robot, giant mole dinosaur creature. But yeah, no, Mogira was going to be in this, decided against it, and I didn't have a way for them to really kill Space Godzilla like that, other than, the Earth monsters somehow broke the spines, and I don't know. I think the missile strike on Space Godzilla spikes works a little bit more, and again ties into the theme. It sort of breaks away his ability to siphon energy. Yeah. And here's some drawings for these hypothetical monster designs. I'll include drawings for the monsters that only appear in the backstory. Anyways, that's really all I have for this video. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed this sort of thing. I'm experimenting here, and a good portion of this video is unscripted. So yeah. Anyways, thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe if you like this video, and let me know any other sort of ideas you might have for this sort of thing. Thank you. Also, leave feedback for my writing, because I do actually want to learn how to write these sorts of stories. I love these. Alright, bye-bye.